a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds. Even the olive tree and cactus, those fast friends of worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. Mark Twain said this in 1867 when he came to visit Israel. It just shows how far we've gone from 1867 to where we are today with the extremely prosperous country that we have these days.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Within Zionism, here with Ozzy Fine and Moshe Schwartzberg. How are you, Moshe?
Good, how are you, Ozzy?
Doing awesome. So, today we're going to be talking about a few things. We're going to be talking about the First Aliyah. We're going to be talking about Theodore Herzl. We're going to be talking about the Dreyfus affair. We're going to be talking about the creation of the IDF. So yeah, let's get into it.
Take it away, Ozzy.
All right, we'll do. So, the First Aliyah, it was actually, so the first one was in Russia. It originated from there, and it came in two waves. So the first wave was, there was a group of Zionist Jews, and they never actually followed through with their, Zionism, and so they never actually went through with it until anti-Semitism got really bad in Russia. So that's when they decided to actually go through with it and make Aliyah and move to Israel. So that happened in 1881
Yeah, and
to 1882.
along with them, they brought some people that just ran away because of the anti-Semitism that was happening in Russia.
100%, yeah. So there was the Zionist Jews, but they also brought the Jews who were just scared and needed somewhere to run to. And what better place for a Jew than Israel? So then that happened again in 1890 to 1891. Again, the same thing. It was just the second wave. And then in the early 1900s, a group of Jews came from Yemen. They were actually expecting the Mashiach in Israel. So that's what caused them to come. So during these years, about 25,000 Jews immigrated from Russia and a few other countries as well. And about 2,500 arrived from Yemen. So yeah, it was like, it's crazy that anti-Semitism actually brought them to Israel. This was before anything was in Israel. There was nothing here at that point, but there was anti-Semitism going on. These Jews were being physically hurt, emotionally hurt. They weren't able to really be Jewish in their homes. So it didn't feel like home to them. So that brought them to Israel, and I think that's awesome. That's what, kickstarted a few
Yeah,
other things to lead with that.
it's an amazing thing, but we're going to talk about Herzl as he is the father of modern day Zionism. He was born in 1860 in Hungary, and he was just someone who. Well, let's get into why he believed so strongly in Zionism. What's called the Dreyfus affair. Well, Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army. He was framed for espionage. Espionage. Yeah.
Spying.
There was evidence
That's a
proving.
French word for spying.
Yeah, there was evidence proving he was innocent. He was still convicted. He was sent to the Devil's Island. We're not going to get into that, but just in short, it's an island that was owned by the French off in the northern Atlantic. It was considered to be hell by the prisoners that went there. It was
It's
just
built for the worst
not.
of the worst.
Yeah, it was not a place that should be for someone who
Right.
was innocent. Now, Herzl ties into this because he was a reporter at the case. So, at this time, Herzl was basically a nobody. No Zionism, nothing. He was just the reporter at the case. And he didn't like it that a Jew like Dreyfus could get so far into society in the army. He was an officer, after all, and still be a
So
victim
someone
of
on such a
anti-Semitism.
high level to be in that point, even though he was innocent, just because he was Jewish.
Yeah, so that basically convinced Herzl that no matter what, the Jews needed their own homeland. Now, he also believed that the Jews, once they have their own homeland, they would be just like everyone else and would stop all anti-Semitism because there's no more Jewish immigrants just roaming about all of the different people in their different countries. We'd have
So
our own
his
country.
mindset was, we Jews are in our country, and then because we're in our country, we're not scattered around the world anymore. We're away from everyone else. So there would be no more reason for anti-Semitism. That was how he saw it.
Right, and just like we said, there was Zionism before him. He didn't create the idea of Zionism. He was just that first seed that basically brought a whole avalanche to what we know as Israel today.
He was the first Zionism activist, you could say. Because before that whole scenario was the Jews from Russia. So they weren't really activists. Like they came to Israel because of anti-Semitism, and they ended up in Israel because they're Jewish and that's what they believed in. But they didn't really try to create a country once they were here. They weren't activists. So I think Theodore Herzl was actually the first Zionist activist.
Yes. Now, sadly, he died in 1904. Before anything really started to happen, the first major milestone that we're going to talk about today happened 13 years after he died in 1917. The 2nd of November 1917, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild making it public knowledge that the British support the Jewish homeland. This was a milestone because up until now there was no empire, there was no one publicly stating, anyone who had power, that the Jews should have their own land. Now, obviously, it wasn't easily accessible, but it did happen at some point. As you know, we have our own land. But this was the first milestone where someone with great power said, you guys should have your own land. Now, let's move from 1917 to the 1930s to 1940s. This is
We're
right
going through a
before.
little timetable over here.
Yeah, let's move forward in Minharat Azman. It's a Hebrew book for those of you who don't know. Let's fast forward in time to the 1930s to 1940s, where this is basically after the British said that we should get our own land, but before we actually got it, 1948. What actually ended up happening is we kind of needed to fight for our own land. The three main brigades were the Haganah, the Lehi, and the Etzel. They all believed in the same exact thing. Let's say it all together: Zionism. They all believed that we should have our own country. The way they did it was a bit different. Some were fighting with the British, some against the British, but they all were trying to fight
So it's
for
like you
Israel.
have three different groups of quote unquote armies, and they each had a different way of fighting. So this was before the IDF. This was actually before there was an official army for the country. That's why I said quote unquote, because they weren't actually an army. These were just groups of people who were fighting, brigades. And each brigade had a different vision on how Israel will be claimed to them in a way. Each of
Yeah,
them thought that this way was good or that way was good, and so there were three different, again, quote unquote armies fighting to get Israel.
yeah. Now let's put the history aside for a minute. Let's move back to modern day. Many people think that if you're not fighting in Israel, fighting in the army, or an activist in Israel, then you're not actually a Zionist. Now, we'd like to point out that is completely not true. You don't have to be inside Israel, living in Israel, doing anything in Israel to be a Zionist. We'd love to have you here if you can. If you can't, that's perfectly fine. Being in any country in the world, talking about Israel, just believing that Israel is our country, you are a Zionist in your own way.
Zionism is a mindset. It's not an act. You could be a Zionist activist, and you could do things. That is definitely an amazing option. But if you don't do that, it doesn't mean you're not an act. It doesn't mean you're not a Zionist. A Zionist. Sorry. It's again, Zionism is just a mindset, and if you believe that Israel belongs to the Jews for whatever reason, there's so many different reasons and different opinions for Jews to believe that we're supposed to be in Israel. Whatever your reason is, as long as your end belief is that Jews belong in Israel, you're a Zionist. That's that. So we actually just spoke the other day with somebody who will sometime soon be on our podcast, and he is actually living in America, and he is an activist, and he's advocating for Zionism. Um, we'll, we'll get to his story when we have him on the show, but he's an example of somebody who is advocating outside of Israel and bringing a lot of Jews to Israel, and he's doing his part even though he's not actually here.
Yeah, so that aside, let's get back to the history. So we've spoken about all of these different brigades fighting to get Israel, to get our own country. 1948 comes by, the British Mandate ends. They had to create a single defense force. The Israel Defense Force was created, also known as the IDF. According to Ben-Gurion, they couldn't have three different armies fighting under one nation. So what he had to do was create them into one. Now that's a whole different episode of how they got together and all the troubles that went through that. But for now, it didn't go really smoothly. But in the end, we have the IDF and they defend us very well. Now, 1948, creation of Israel. אני מכריז בזאת על הקמה מדינה יהודית היא בארץ ישראל, so on and so forth. That's what Ben-Gurion said in the words that are etched in every Israeli mind from the moment they start school. What actually created Israel? Again, we will get into that next episode. That's going to be an amazing episode. But for now, we created Israel. We've got our own land. After 2,000 years of the Galut, from going from country to country, never having our own land where we can say, this is home. We have our own land. We have our home.
That basically sums it up. That's just basically a brief beginning of just like a little part of the history of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, it's crazy going all the way from Mark Twain saying that even the cactus won't grow in Israel, all the way to having skyscrapers.
Look at Israel now. I mean, now summer's coming, so now everything's gonna be brown. But if you look at Israel, like right now, before everything goes brown and dry, it's all green. It's such a beautiful country. To go from nothing to what we have today, Jerusalem, if you go like down south or up north or wherever you go, there's so many beautiful places, and it all originated from not that long ago when there was nothing here. When Mark Twain came, it was not that long ago. That wasn't thousands of years ago. It wasn't the times of dinosaurs. It was recent. It was a long time ago, but it was recent. And there was nothing when he came. And look at it now. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing when you can go down south right after it's rained, and you can just drive down in the desert and you will see flowers. You'll see a lot of trees and bushes and stuff that shouldn't be down in the desert.
Yeah, I was gonna say things that don't belong end up in places where they just look really good.
Yeah. Okay, that about sums up today's episode. Follow us on our social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @WithinZionism. Leave us a comment wherever you listen to our podcast. feedback, something. Just let us know that you are there. We love hearing from you, even if it's just to say hi. We'll have better audio in the near future. We're trying a few different techniques before our mics actually come. Let us know about this week's episode. We love it. We love hearing from you. When people say that fixes here and there, just let us know. Stay tuned for next week, where we start talking about the creation of Israel and the IDF.